It's maybe fitting to think about this a little bit. We're an Episcopal church at the Redeemer. We're sponsoring an evening with an American Baptist in a Jesuit institution. And so perhaps to open it, I can refer to a Presbyterian. Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was very active in the middle part of the 20th century, very famous man, very famous preacher, was unembarrassed to call himself a liberal evangelical, which he didn't think was a contradiction in terms. And in his autobiography, published in 1956, he excoriated both sides, the left, the liberal end of the spectrum, and the evangelical end of the spectrum, both the modernists and the neo-orthodox, and wound up at the same time hoping that because there was so much good in both of those sides that someday there would be a synthesis. Someday there would be a synthesis. The more I read of God's politics and listen to Jim, the more I believe that maybe we are on the verge of such a synthesis, both in our life as churches and perhaps finally in our common life in polity as well. And I just want to read one piece from God's politics that made a particular difference when I was reading it. Jim writes, "Our private religions have failed, but we must not lose a personal God. Instead of trying to strike an elusive balance between private piety and the social gospel, we must go to the heart of prophetic religion itself, in which a personal God demands public justice as an act of worship. We meet the personal God in the public arena and are invited to take our relationship to that God right into the struggle for justice. Indeed, without that personal relationship, we will lose the political struggle. That shift, bringing the personal God into the public arena, is at the heart of the prophet's message and will transform both our religion and our politics." Jim Wallis, the founder of Sojourners and head of Called Renewal, has spoken all across the country. You wouldn't be here if you didn't know about him. And so in the hope that what I just read is will be taken one further step to fulfillment this evening. Jim, thank you for being here. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. It's good to be here at Boston College, and I'm sorry to miss Alan Wolf, one of my favorite Jesuits. Alan is one of the clearest thinkers in the country on religion and politics, so I really am grateful to be here. Dorsey, thank you. I think we are at a place, perhaps, of moving beyond the old disparities and categories and finding some common ground. It's great to be sponsored by an Episcopal church as well. My wife, Joy Carroll, is a priest from Church of England, one of the first women ordained there 10 years ago. And she always likes it when I'm in Episcopal company. She says, somebody has to look after you properly. So she'd be pleased that I was here tonight. She's known in Britain. There was a hit comedy series in Britain called The Vicar of Dibley. And Richard Curtis, who's the screenwriter for that show, went to the Synod of the Church of England to find a real woman priest to help shape the show and the role model of the character. And he met Joy, who was speaking that day on the ordination of women. And so Joy became the script consultant and role model. Joy's known in Britain as the real Vicar of Dibley. So I'm very familiar with the Episcopal Church. This topic of religion can be quite confusing, let's admit it. It's a confusing topic. A few weeks ago, I've got two boys, Jack is 2 and Luke is 7. Jack came up to his mother and said, "Mom, I'm real worried about Max and Jonah, 2 of his second grade pals. I'm worried because I don't think they believe in God or Jesus. They're vegetarians." So on the book tour, when we were going to the Pacific Northwest on that second, we took Luke along, so in Oregon he could meet some godly vegetarians, you know. But it is confusing, and one of the most confusing things is how so many people in this country still think religion is the exclusive territory of the right wing. That's a very confusing thing, even for many an alienating thing. But I think the landscape is changing dramatically on the issues of religion and public life, faith, and politics in America. I tell too many stories about my son, but we were trick-or-treating, Luke and I, just before the election, working the streets of our Columbia Heights neighborhood. And he looked up at me, perhaps sensing the national mood, and he said, "Daddy, this election is more important than Halloween, isn't it?" And indeed it was. And the role of religion became a very prominent theme throughout this election. We went on this book tour shortly after, I think, Inauguration Week, and I began to see things and hear things around the country that really began to change my sense of what was happening. I met people all across the country who looked at the way religion was used and abused in the election, they would say, looked at the way it's been portrayed for decades now in the media, and the way it's often invoked in the corridors of power. And they said to themselves, wait a minute, I'm a person of faith too, and that is not my faith. You ever feel that way? Or I have moral values too, and those aren't my moral values. And so within a few days, we had town meetings disguised as book signings and revivals in bookstores all across the country. And I met a whole lot of people who just had felt left out of this conversation. I listened to them. I learned from them, and I was deeply encouraged by what I saw. So tonight I want to start by talking about how I think the landscape is changing on this whole topic of faith and politics. I went to the East and the Midwest and the South and Texas and the Mountain States and California and the Pacific Northwest to meet the godly vegetarians. And after a few weeks, it was clear to me something was happening that I began to announce at these meetings. And it was a simple thing, just saying that I now think, and I'm now convinced of this, I now think that the monologue of the religious right is finally over and a new dialogue has just begun. That I'm now persuaded is the truth around the country. Well, I want to tell you who's coming out to these meetings, these town meetings, and maybe you'll recognize yourself in the guest list. First, there were lots of evangelical Christians who, particularly a younger generation of evangelicals, who don't feel represented by a handful of television preachers whose names you know. Then there were a lot of Catholics who don't feel spoken for by a handful of bishops really on the right side of the spectrum who said there's only one issue on which Catholics are allowed to vote. Now, if this is a Jesuit school, I hope you've learned something about Catholic social teaching. It's a bit broader than single-issue voting. And they are there to say that we want to look at the whole range of Catholic social teaching. Then there were the mainline Protestants who came, like my wife's new church, the Episcopals, and they feel in this conversation about faith and politics, well, to use my neighborhood's language, a bit dissed, a bit disrespected, as if they're not even people of faith in the mainline churches. That's how they're often made to feel. A lot of black Christians came out because this has been, let's face it, a pretty white conversation. When the media says evangelicals, They mean white evangelicals. They don't mean the historic black churches. Never. Very different things happening there. A lot of Latino Christians and Asian Christians who are changing the face of all the churches, they were coming. But so were a lot of rabbis and their congregations who liked the tones of Micah, Amos, and Isaiah applied to domestic and foreign policy again. Then a lot of young Muslims who were fighting for a more tolerant, democratic, compassionate, and yes, peaceful Islam. They talk about the battle for the heart and soul of Islam, inside, going on. And then we had a lot of people who were, they call themselves, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. It's a growing denomination. It's the not religious but spiritual people. I had breakfast in town here 2 weeks ago with Ben Cohen, you know, the ice cream man. Ben said, I'm part of that spiritual but not religious group. You know, I think he'd be a good bishop for this whole new denomination, you know. They were coming in large numbers. And then a lot of young people who said, I'm an agnostic. But I felt welcomed by the conversations, and I felt like I had a part to play. And every time I'd say, religion has no monopoly on morality. That this is a moral discourse on politics that we all need and that we're all needed for. In Boston, we had Trinity Copley Square, one of the first sessions, 1,000 people on a Sunday afternoon. And afterwards, a young man came up to get his book signed, and he said, well, I'm gay. Thank you for making me feel welcome here today. But you know what? It's easier to come out as gay in Boston than as religious in the Democratic Party, he said. So we had that conversation all along the way, too. But I want to say, as Dorsey alluded to, this is not, as some journalists said, well, the journalist said, this is like the rise of the non-religious right. That's not much of a name for a movement, I'll grant you that. But what I sensed was the word movement, or that feeling, was everywhere. People weren't there just to get a book signed. They were there to join something, become part of something, have their faith make a difference in their world. But what this is not is just the emergence of a religious left. Let me say why. I think the religious right was and still is the creation of the political right. There were meetings in the mid-1970s. I could name places. I could name the political operatives of the right. I could name the television preachers who were there. They made deals. Give us your membership list. Give us your database. We'll aim our computers at your constituency. We'll build this block within one party to gain power. We'll be utterly partisan. We won't hold both sides accountable to our standards. This is to win. This is to gain power. We'll build a constituency and use any means necessary to win. Why would anybody want to create a mirror counterpart of that on the left? Utterly partisan religion, not faithful to its own standards, just organizing to win, whether your party stands for anything or not. I think religion is best and serves us best when it is not ideologically predictable or loyally partisan, but is rather a prophetic and dynamic and animating and mobilizing force that has the power, the capacity to criticize left and right from an independent moral ground. That's what we need to restore. Lincoln had it right. You don't say God is on our side. You worry and pray earnestly to be on God's side. The God on our side way leads to bad things in politics, like hubris, overconfidence, triumphalism, and always bad foreign policy. The worrying if we're on God's side leads to the things politics often is lacking: humility, reflection, maybe even accountability. If Lincoln had it right, King did it best. Bible in one hand, Constitution in the other hand. He convened a moral discourse on public life to which all of God's children got invited. There were Baptists like him, Catholics. The Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel came down. And I know agnostics today who were there and are still agnostic, and who say those were the spiritual high points of my life. Because that night in the church, before marching in the street the next day, you had to get spiritually prepared to face the dogs, the police, the water cannons. You had to be ready to demonstrate nonviolence in the face of brutal attacks. I think we need the kind of prophetic faith again that King demonstrated. Most of all, I think religion is not supposed to be a wedge to divide us. It's meant to be a bridge to bring us together on the really big things. I'll say more about that. The subtitle of the book is God's Politics: Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It. Now, the right is very comfortable with the language of religion, values, faith, God. So much so, it seems sometimes to me like they think they own the territory, maybe own God. But then they narrow everything just down to one or two issues. They say there are only two moral values issues in American politics. Just two, making it very simple for us. Abortion, gay marriage, that's the start and the end of the conversation. Now, as we moved around the country, we found in diverse crowds, which I expect we have tonight, we could build some common ground on even those two hot-button, controversial, divisive issues. We found common ground on those issues. We can talk later about that if you want. But I want to say, I still call myself an evangelical Christian. I find 3,000 verses in the Bible about poor people, and I insist fighting poverty is a moral values issue too. And there's a whole generation of faith-inspired young people who want to tell us that protecting the environment, otherwise known as God's creation, is a moral values issue too. And now, as we face almost 2,000 dead Americans in Iraq and tens of thousands of dead Iraqis, I want to say that whether you go to war, when you go to war, and whether you tell the truth about going to war is a deeply religious matter too. How is it, some of us wonder, that Jesus has become pro-rich, pro-war, and only pro-American? Or as my English wife says, don't they know that God bless America isn't found anywhere in the Bible? When they try and steal your faith in the public arena, sometimes it becomes time to take it back. And that's what lots of people are now doing. When you're on a book tour, they put you on these TV shows, and sometimes you do the O'Reilly factor, and sometimes you have fun. And actually, Bill was pretty good that night. We had a good conversation. The next night, though, was a Jon Stewart Daily Show. How many of you ever watch that? Well, Jon Stewart is a very funny guy, but he's a very serious guy and a very smart guy. And he came back before the show, and we had some conversation. And I knew he'd read the book because he was asking questions from the last few chapters, you know. And he asked very smart questions. He said, what's the relationship between aid and debt and trade and overcoming global poverty? That's a smart question. And then he said, I'm afraid I'm going to ask silly questions out there. I said, John, I think that's your job, to ask silly questions. And we got out and he said, so, Jim, you want to apply, like, religion and the words of Jesus to politics? And I could feel his youthful audience around the country, millions of them, saying to themselves, oh no, he's got some wacko evangelical preacher on my favorite TV show, going to ruin my show, you know. And I said, yeah, John, but I hardly think Jesus' two top priorities would have been a capital gains tax cut and the occupation of Iraq. And then they began to cheer, and I talked about the 25th chapter of Matthew, which is my conversion text, when Jesus says, as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. And they began to go, yeah, yeah, yeah. They're cheering for Matthew 25 on Jon Stewart, you know. Then we got this kind of Christian-Jewish banter going, and he asked a question. I said, good question, John. He says, you mean good question for a Jewish guy? I know we're not going to heaven, but can we have a neighborhood nearby? We'll keep it clean, he said. And I said, you know, John, the Hebrew prophets used humor and satire and truth-telling to make their points. You do all three very well. Maybe, John, you're in the tradition, Jon Stewart, of the biblical prophets. He goes, oh, no. He says, do they watch Saturday Night Live? He said. But afterwards, the emails came. Thousands of emails from his audience, a lot of young people. And I was amazed at the emails. They said things like, I lost my faith because of television preachers, bad religious fundraising, pedophile priests, cover-up bishops, White House theology. I lost my faith. Or they said amazingly, I didn't know, this was stunning to me, I didn't know you could be a Christian and care about poverty, care about the environment, care about the war in Iraq. I didn't know, because all they had been presented with was this one-sided, very partisan notion of religion used for such overtly political purposes. They didn't know that. Because, in part, because the left doesn't get it. The left has forgotten its own history, where there was every major social reform movement in our nation's past: abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, child labor law reform, and most famously civil rights. Every one was fueled and driven in large part by religion and by faith. Where would we be if the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had kept his faith to himself, or the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel or Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker? Where would we be? I believe in the separation of church and state. I really do. That doesn't mean the segregation of moral values from public life, or the banishing of religious language from the public square. There is a way to invoke faith and religion that respects democracy, pluralism, diversity, and the Constitution. We have a history of it. We've done it before, and we can do it again. The biggest mistake that progressives have made in the last several decades is the conceding of the entire territory of religion and faith to a religious and political right, which is then defined in the most narrow partisan way possible. Progressives should never make that mistake again. The reason why I get so charged up about this left-right polarization, paralyzing of discourse, is because we miss the power of what religion is supposed to be and do. We miss the power of faith in society. I remember speaking to a group very different than this. It wasn't a great university or a church. It was the inmates, the prisoners at Sing Sing prison in upstate New York. Come and speak to us, they said. So it sounded interesting. I wrote back, said, sure. When do you want me to come? This young prisoner, young brother, wrote back on behalf of his friends. He said, well, he said, we're free most nights. He said, we're kind of a captive audience here. So we worked it out, and the authorities gave us this room down in the bowels of that infamous Sing Sing prison. And I was alone in this room for 5 hours with 80 guys from Sing Sing. Amazing night. And one of those young guys said something to me that night I won't ever forget. He said, you know, Jim, all of us here at Sing Sing are from just 4 or 5 neighborhoods in New York City. 4 or 5 neighborhoods. It's like a train, he says. You get on that train when you're 9 or 10 years old. Starts in my neighborhood. And it ends up here at Sing Sing. What an image. What a metaphor. A fast-moving urban train beginning in only certain zip codes, going to inevitable destinations like Sing Sing. He'd had a spiritual conversion inside the walls of that prison. He was part of a program called, it's the New York Theological Seminary's program, teaching, training masters of divinity inside the walls of the prison. You become a preacher in the joint, and you graduate when your sentence is up. He looked at me in the eye and he said, when I get out, I want to go back and stop that train. 2 years later, I was in New York City leading a town meeting. Guess who was up front, moderating the meeting? Back home, stopping that train. You see, faith is meant to be for the big things, the things that seem impossible, that have no hope of changing, where the odds are against us. That's why we call it faith. My Bible says if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain, it says. We've got some mountains to move, like those fast-moving urban trains. It's a big thing. Here's another one. 3 billion people, half of God's children on the planet, half of us live on less than $2 a day. That's a big thing. Or 30,000 children who died yesterday, today, and will tomorrow. Why? Lack of clean drinking water. My 7-year-old still just can't get his head around that one. You mean they don't have any, they can't go in the bathroom and get a drink of water? Or diseases that no one dies of here? Nobody. Or not enough food to eat. Poverty kills 30,000 kids every day in a silent tsunami. That's a big thing. Faith is meant to change the big things. I'm a 19th century evangelical, Dorsey, born in the wrong century. Because back then, evangelical Christians helped lead the battle against slavery, for women's suffrage, for labor law reform. They were revivalists and abolitionists, reformers, and they were evangelists. And Charles Finney was the Billy Graham of his day. He invented the altar call. You know why? You all know the altar call, Billy Graham and all that. You know what the first altar call was for? Finney was having lots of converts, and he decided he had to get their names and addresses to sign them up for the anti-slavery campaign. That's why we had the first altar call. I see a new altar call arising across the country, around the world, a new generation of faith-inspired activists for whom poverty is the new slavery, enslaving hearts and minds and bodies. And in Britain, I saw these banners outside churches at the G8. We had the first ever religious summit at a G8 meeting. But outside churches, I saw these banners that said, "Make poverty history." That may become the new altar call. The waters of Katrina have washed away lives, cities, property. They're also washing away, I think, our public denial of how many people are still poor in this country. They're washing away our reluctance to admit the still persistent connection between race and poverty in America. Could they also wash away the kind of misguided priorities and ideologies which have eroded the common good and shredded our social infrastructures? America learned that those who got left behind in New Orleans had already been left out in America. America looked under a rock and didn't like what we saw. We were stunned, we were shocked, we were angry. We have now, I think, a teachable moment that needs good teachers. Around the country as I travel, I find a whole lot of people across the religious and political spectrums. I think it's time to do something about so many people in this richest nation in the world still poor, let alone the even more staggering facts of global poverty. Yet in Washington, the attitude is pretty much, damn the hurricane, full speed ahead, as if nothing happened. I don't know how you feel, but when I say around the country that a time of war, a time of rising deficits, a time of rising poverty, each year for the last 4 years, poverty has risen in America. And a time of natural disaster is no time to keep cutting taxes for the wealthy and cutting services to the poorest families in America. But that's what they're planning to do. All across the country, I think something else is happening, particularly among younger people. On this book tour, I expected college students, because I'm on campuses a lot, and that's why I go there. I'm at Harvard on Mondays this fall because of what's happening on campuses. But they seem younger to me than that as we went along. And I'd ask, you student? Yeah. What year? Well, freshman. Where? High school. Mom and Dad weren't there. Just he and his friends, listening, paying attention. 14-year-olds, 13-year-olds. Got to Minneapolis, and standing at the book table was this little tiny girl. I said, how old are you? She said, I'm 11. You're 11. What did you get from tonight? I asked her. Well, she said, I think we're just going to have to change the world. Who's going to do that? I said, well, I think people like me. I told her story the next night in Tacoma, Washington. And I looked up from the table, and here's even a tiny little girl who grins at me and says, 9! So I told her story in Seattle the next night, and I looked up, and this littlest one of all, and she very quietly says, I think I may be the youngest so far. I said, and how old are you? I'm 8 years old. What made sense to you tonight? I just stopped the line for a few minutes. She said, well, when you talked about that, you know, that everyday tsunami that's killing all the children, like me, I was just sitting there, and I thought, if I'm a Christian, I better do something about that. She's in the 3rd grade. So I told my Harvard students the next week, if you all want to lead in this movement, you better get going fast, because a whole generation is coming in behind you. They're going to push you right out of the way, you know. I want to end the night with a choice that I think is the big choice, the really big choice we have to make. It's not the one that some say the choice is between, they say, belief and secularism. Something that say that's the big choice. I don't think it is. There are issues there, but this is the real choice. Choice is between hope on the one hand and cynicism on the other. Let me say a word for the cynics. Cynics I appreciate because they don't see the world through rose-colored glasses. They see it as it is, and they're against all the bad stuff. They really are. In fact, they even probably tried for a while to change the bad stuff. But it didn't change. They got disappointed, disillusioned, and maybe they began to feel kind of out there and kind of vulnerable. So they withdrew, stepped back to a place called cynicism, where you're still against all the bad stuff, but you don't think it could ever change. So you start to say, it's okay to surround myself with a little security. Cynicism is a buffer against commitment. Cynicism is a buffer against commitment. Hope, on the other hand, isn't a feeling or a state of mind or a personality trait. Hope is a decision. It's a choice you make because of whatever you call faith. My Bible also says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, or my best paraphrase is, hope means believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. I argue history changes when a critical mass of people decides to make that decision to hope. Always has and always will. And when I'm on campuses like this, I always say they should shut down their career counseling department. Because career is where you assemble your assets, put them in a resume, and then you try and find the ladder of ascent where you can begin on the highest rung. My Harvard students think because they're Harvard students, they should start on rung 4 at least. Vocation is different than career. And a Catholic school should be teaching you that, if it is. Vocation is where you don't assemble your assets, you discern your gift. What's your gift? What's down deep? What's gut, soul, heart stuff? What are you really passionate about? What are you really good at? What do you lose track of time when you're doing? What were you probably put on this planet for? That's probably close to what your gift is. Where your gift meets the crushing needs of the world, at that intersection, that's your vocation. Right there. That's your vocation. I did 3 commencements last June. This year I'll do one at one of those prisons in New York State for the Masters of Divinity whose sentences are up. I always ask at a commencement this question: what's your big thing? What's your big thing? What big thing are you going to be a part of doing? We ask so little of people. Churches ask for the edges of people's lives, and that's what they get. We don't ask for the heart, the center of people's passion, what they're really good at. Social movements are what change history, not politicians. Don't ask in the question time which politician, has the best chance of doing this stuff. Social movements change politicians and change politics. Lyndon Johnson wasn't a civil rights leader until Martin Luther King Jr. made him one. Social movements are what change history. All we need to change the big stuff is for critical mass to decide for hope against cynicism, to find their gift, discern their vocation, and join the movement. That's all we need. It's worked well before. It can work well again. I met Evan tonight down here, who told me he'd been to South Africa and had some things change his life when he was there. So I told him I was going to close the story about South Africa, because I got changed there too, Evan. I was there during the most difficult time. Nelson Mandela was still in prison. You couldn't say ANC out loud without being put in prison. All the activists had been killed, tortured, imprisoned, or exiled. The only ones left standing were a handful of religious leaders, some courageous priests, pastors, and rabbis, and some imams. That was all, just a handful of religious people left. Among them was Desmond Tutu, Archbishop in Cape Town. St. George's Cathedral was his little church. It wasn't a big cathedral, small little place. And they were in trouble. The government had bombed the South African Council of Churches. They'd bombed Kotze House. Everybody was in jail. They were threatening the churches, and the cry for help went out. And I got snuck in the country via some back doors to avoid the security lists, and I was to meet Desmond Tutu at his cathedral that morning. I got there, and a political rally had been called and canceled by the government. So Desmond says, okay, we're going to have church. Try and cancel that. Well, they didn't want to cancel church. So he had church. Outside, there were 3 times as many police, security, military personnel as there were worshipers on the inside. 3 to 1 at least. They were there fully armed, riot gear. They were there to intimidate, to frighten us, to make us afraid. And at least with me, it was working pretty well. Desmond Tutu stood to preach in that pulpit in St. George's Cathedral. And just as he did, the dreaded South African security police, who were thugs, I've been interrogated by them, they are thugs. They broke the doors open, and they began to stand alongside the walls of his cathedral with tape recorders and pads of paper, writing down and recording whatever he said, as if to say, go ahead, you be bold, you be prophetic. We just put you in jail, we'll put you there again. Go ahead, we got you. And he stopped preaching, and we all watched him. What would he say? What would he do? And Desmond Tutu looked from one side to the other, and he said to them, pointing his finger, you are powerful. You are very powerful, but you are not gods, and I serve a God who cannot be mocked. Then he got back in his pulpit and says, he began, you remember that smile, that signature smile? He started smiling at them and then laughing at them. Of course, he's a bishop. He laughed politely, you know. He says, since you've already lost, then he began to bounce like a good black Baptist preacher in Alabama, you know. Since you've already lost, we invite you today to come and join the winning side. And the crowd erupted, and the young people began this dance, this kind of stomping dance called the Toy Toy. Did you see that? And they danced us outside, and the police moved back. They didn't expect dancing worshipers. And we danced in the streets of South Africa with the police all around us. 10 years later, I'm at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela. Guess who is master of ceremonies for the inauguration? Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The birth of a new nation. He's the MC. I said, Desmond, do you remember what you said that morning in St. George's? Remember what you said? And he smiled. He remembered. I said, Bishop, today they've all joined the winning side. You couldn't find one white South African that day who hadn't always been against apartheid. See, Desmond Tutu understood the dynamics of history, which are faith prompts hope, makes action, causes change. He wasn't some idealistic, utopian, religious fanatic. He just knew how history changes. We, as people of faith, aren't really needed on the inauguration day. That's the party. The party's great to be at. There were 150,000 South Africans that day. I stood with them, tears coming down our faces as Nelson Mandela announced the birth of a new nation. We're not needed at the party, the celebration. We're needed back there at St. George's, when you can only see that day through the eyes of faith. I believe those fast-moving urban trains can be stopped. I believe we don't have to accept economic doctrines that just continue to erode, despoil, poison our natural habitat. I believe we don't have to live with half of us living on just $2 a day. I believe we can change the big stuff. That's what faith is for. We've done it before. We can do it again. And as I travel the country, I think our time has finally come. Hope means believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. Thank you very much.
We're going to have a period of a half hour now for questions. Jim will take them. The two gentlemen in the aisles here will be responsible for doing their best to be fair and catch questions as they come up. Just a couple of ground rules. Questions, please, not speeches, if we could. And also keep in mind that there are other people who would like to ask questions as well. So brevity is appreciated. And if any of my parishioners out there, please don't remember that I ever said that, all right? Please. But tonight, special rules, okay. So, and there is also a sign-up list that is going around saying, get connected with Jim Wallis. We encourage you to sign up on that. Gets you on Sojo Mail and connected with Call to Renewal in interesting ways. So, please.
When we're on campuses, we have these email altar calls. And I say, I know your email is like your essence. It's your connection to the world. But if you want, movements are about being connected. And so if you want to get on our, it's student rights free monthly email newsletter, just sign up and we'll link you to all kinds of hopeful people and things and projects going on around the world. So who's got a question?
Thanks for coming. I think we're both fairly critical of the relationship between the right and the Christian right, I would suppose. But it seems to me that, well, it seems like corrupt and unjust and sacrilegious almost. Are you at all worried that the same thing would happen if the left had a similar marriage with Christianity?
It's a good question. You know, in my class today over at the Div School, the topic was the God gap between Republicans and Democrats and how a 2-to-1 ratio church-going folks vote Republican and so on. And the Democrats are getting interested in religion because they lost. And some of them are just wanting, well, they want a few Bible verses and some hymns and learn how to clap at the right time in a black church. You know? Others are going deeper to content and vision and substance. And I think, yes, there's a danger. There's always a danger of seduction. Washington, D.C. is a town where access is the coin of the realm. Who you talk to, who you're meeting with, access for its own sake is highly prized. No one ever asks, what is this access for? Why are we having this conversation? So I think there are people of faith on the Democratic side who really want to be free to let their own religion or their own values shine through. There are Republicans who want to move beyond this narrow conversation about abortion, gay marriage, and talk about a Republican anti-poverty agenda too. We're talking to both sides. But I think you've got to be very careful. If we look at this sort of biblically, in the Bible you have prophets in the court of the king, the court prophets, who are on the payroll of the king, and they told the king what the king wanted to hear about religion. But the prophets of Yahweh were generally out in the wilderness, and they spoke truth to power from an independent base. I think King did that too. King worked the corridors of power, but his base wasn't in them. His base was in a movement outside of politics, and he was able to speak, I think, therefore, a prophetic word. But that's always the danger, always.
You're not talking about like brokering a deal here, though, or are you? You talk of like a very more formal deal, kind of brokered between the right and Christian sects. Are you looking for a similar type of deal?
No. I'm saying that's why I don't want to help be part of a religious left, because it would be that same kind of deal. It would be using religion for power, ends justify the means. I mean, I don't find the right very critical of their own side of politics, even by their own standards. So there's a double standard, there's a hypocrisy going on, because this is for power. So progressive religious folks shouldn't make that kind of deal with the Democratic Party. I agree. One right down here.
So I'm wondering if you can talk to us about the ministries that have impressed you that embody or enflesh the kind of message that you think is important.
Some of us at the church had a chance to talk over dinner about some of this. And I see the best. I mean, I'm blessed because I get to be with the best people. There's a guy coming tomorrow, a good friend of mine, who's Nane Alejandras. He's Barrios Unidos, Neighborhoods United. Nane was a drug dealer. He was a gang warfare capitan. He was in prison. He was a Vietnam vet. He was a warrior in the streets, and he had a conversion through Native American elders. And now he leads Barrios Unidos. They're in probably 50 cities across the country doing the best gang truce work that I've ever seen, and youth work in the streets. And he's created businesses, and they do sweats up in the mountains, these native prayer services. And he's just, he told me once, he says, come see what we're doing. And I went out there, and he says, look, and they tell us, don't do graffiti on the walls, do it on T-shirts. We're going to sell this stuff. We silkscreen this stuff. They got Cesar Chavez School of Social Change. They got all this stuff going on. He says, I said, what do you need to keep this going? He said, well, we need $30,000 of loan capital. I said, Nani, $30,000 of loan capital? He said, yeah, it's really all we need. We'd pay it back. I said, well, surely you can raise, no, I got tattoos up and down both arms, a criminal record longer than both legs. Nobody will talk to me at a bank or a credit union. So I took him to the Lutheran Church in Chicago, and Nani came back with a check for $100,000 from the Lutherans, which he's then brokered to be his support all over the country. Now he's got these things going. And he'll come and talk to our staff tomorrow, and he'll fill the room with vision and hope, and because he's doing what no one thought could be done. I've seen him literally standing between rival gangs with guns on the street saying, no, don't shoot, don't fire. And he's got the credibility to stop the gunfire and build alternatives. But Nani would be the first to tell you, like we talked about over supper, that you can't just keep pulling bodies out of the river and not send somebody upstream to see what or who is throwing them in. So the ministries are powerful, and some of them create models that are replicable. You can do what people are doing in housing and healthcare, in other places, but you got to change policies and practices and habits and states of mind that keep things the way that they are. So I want to move from ministries to models to movements, because movements are what really change how a nation thinks. And that's what's critical. Yes. Where? Ah, way up there.
I like some
In the
of your,
balcony.
pardon me? I like some of the principles, and my question has to do with applying some of these principles you've been mentioning to the educational institutions, particularly one like Boston College. I understand originally St. Ignatius, and this is according to Father John O'Malley, who wrote a book on the first Jesuits. St. Ignatius insisted when he was founding his colleges and schools that no tuition could be charged to the students because he wanted to include the poor with the wealthy. And that lasted quite a while. Now, even when I was going to Catholic parochial school and high school, no tuition was charged. The parishes paid for that. Now, I'm getting the impression now that, especially in the Catholic schools, but I think it's broader, the church-supported schools, the religion schools, like Boston College, are moving away from the poor. The tuition is so high that the poor can't get at them. I mean, they make an attempt, I admit, with scholarships and all, but in general, we're moving away from the poor as a church. Do you have any faith or hope that we could actually run religion schools without charging tuition to the students or a place like
Don't
this?
you all go to school for free here? Well, I'm shocked to hear that. Again, we talked over dinner about the deeper issue there, which is the lack of proximity that most middle-class folks have to people who are poor. Poverty in this country is very focused, it's concentrated, it's ghettoized. Most poor people live in a very few places in America, which means the rest of us drive around, fly over, don't ever touch or taste or feel or listen to anybody who's poor, and there's no sense of relationship. What also happens, therefore, is the pathologies of poverty, and there are pathologies of poverty, get concentrated. So my neighborhood for a long time has had 80% single-parent families. You can't overcome poverty with 80% single-parent families. You know, if boys don't have dads, all the data shows trouble begins to start. Well, if you're in a circumstance where some of the boys don't have dads, the dads who are there are particularly aware of that. I'm a t-ball coach, and I'm aware of my kids who don't have dads in a particular way. But when nobody has a dad, when no one is even in a household where there's a marriage in a household, when no one's ever been to a wedding, when no one has a job that pays a living family income, when there's drugs and violence everywhere, and when single moms who are heroically trying to raise those kids have no help at all from extended family systems, then all of the worst things about poverty get worse, and no one has any relationship to that from the outside. And I was saying over dinner, the biblical model for overcoming poverty is inclusion, including people in the community, at the table, at the banquet, the gleanings of the fields, all that. And so when churches, or I'd say when educational institutions lose their proximity to people who are poor, something really goes wrong in a society. And I love the Jesuit tradition, by the way, and I love the early notions of how these schools and as the church was meant to be in relationship to people who were poor. We've lost that not only in the schools, but in the churches. And then we don't know we have no idea what it means to be poor. And so even people who are liberal in their politics often don't have any relationships with anybody. The poor are just objects of our concern, not friends, people who we know, people who we learn from, people whose relationship disciplines our perspective. And I do know some schools that are trying to get back in the relationship. They're doing They're moving back into the city. They're changing their enrollment requirements. They're making part of the education of their students, learning what it means to be poor in that city or in this country. So, but we're way out of relationship, and that's, I think, part of why our education is so skewed. I agree with you.
Hi. My question is more to do with the left in politics. It seems that if you're looking for an alliance between the religion and the left, it would be harder to come by because the left, unlike the right, is not a monoculture, at least in the right in its present incarnation. And so it's difficult because of its elements of secularism to unite religiously in that way. So what do you think is the way to overcome that obstacle?
Well, I find myself often in battles with religious fundamentalists on the one hand, and people I'd call secular fundamentalists on the other hand. Now, again, nothing wrong being secular, you know. In my class, there's no religious requirement, just interest in the topic, or at a night like tonight. And as I say over and over, religion has no monopoly on morality. But secular fundamentalism has a disdain for religion, for people of faith, for spirituality. And I think just as the religious fundamentalists have sometimes a stranglehold on the right, secular fundamentalists have that kind of control often on the left, in academia, in interest groups, in the Democratic Party. And so people of faith often feel like they're disrespected. I know, you know, Catholics, Catholic school. I know, you know, New York, Manhattan, Upper West Side, liberal, progressive, academic Catholics who would be democratic in every other way, but they feel disrespected by the Democratic Party around some of their central beliefs and convictions. So I think, and when people who are in the Democratic Party, who are people of faith, feel marginalized by their own party, not just by the religious right, something is wrong here. So I was able to speak at the first ever People of Faith luncheon at the Democratic Convention, first ever, that says something by itself. And I just said, you know, to be a Democrat, you don't have to be a person of faith, but if you're motivated by moral values, let those values shine through. Talk about them. As values, if you're motivated by faith, let your faith shine through in a way that's consistent with democracy and pluralism and diversity, but don't be ashamed to be a person of faith. So it's not a monolithic alliance, it's just letting people express who they are as people of faith. Now, to me, it's more than language, because if we're going to take our religion seriously, there's content here. I say to the Democrats, you know, if you want to talk about faith in relation to poverty. 3,000 verses in the Bible about the poor. Talk about health care and education and affordable housing as moral values issues too. And they're not doing that. They're starting to sort of consider that, but they're still not talking about their issues as moral values questions. And that's, I think, what could change. Right? Can we pass the mic down the middle there?
I'm a young pastor in suburbia outside of Boston, and I think one of the things that I was really disappointed with this fall is that I offered this book as a study, as an adult education series, and I had about, in a church of well over 500, about 10 people come to something. I was really excited about beginning this discussion and talking about this in our church, and you know, even less that were willing to come to Boston College with me tonight. And I guess what I want to know is, or what I'm asking is some practical sort of words of wisdom on how, as a minister, how I help those I minister to want to stand in the cathedral, want to come to the movement. How, when we are a church that obviously is, has a lack of proximity, how do we begin to, or how do I begin to motivate people and really invite people into that movement?
Part of the problem is how we are so politicized or polarized in left-right categories, even in the religious community. So we're afraid of things that feel like they're not from my side of things. The best stories I've heard about the book studies are when they bring together the liberals and the conservatives in the church, and they talk for the first time about all these things, which is never talked about before. I think that's possible, because I think what we're talking about here is not something that neatly fits into those categories. For example, let's take Katrina. There are two obstacles to this nation seriously addressing poverty. One is what I call the priority problem. The poor are not a priority, and you're speaking to that in part with your question. When people are so distant, so removed, they might be good folks. If they ever really ran into a family with kids who are really struggling, chances are their hearts would go out to them. They would connect, and compassion would kick in. But they're never ever in relationship. How do you put poor people, poor families, poor kids on the agenda at all? They're not at the top. They're not even on the agenda. The priority issue is one. Katrina may help us change that. It's too early to say. It may help us change the priority issue. The other is what I call the strategy problem, because you'll hear the big debate, how you overcome poverty. There's a difference in strategy. Well, one side says, the conservative side, it's culture. Other side said it's policy. So people come up to me and say, from one side, they say, well, if those poor people just took personal responsibility and made better choices, and families weren't breaking down, and there wasn't so much sexual promiscuity, and on and on and on, then they could overcome poverty. Other sides say, we just invest in healthcare, housing, education, childcare, that would solve the problem. When I hear those two sides, I know that neither of those sides, people must live or work anywhere near poor people. Because there are personal choices that cause and entrench poverty. Family breakdown, bad choices. Now the difference is, the suburbs outside Washington, D.C., kids also make bad choices, but affluence buffers bad choices. In my neighborhood, a kid can make one bad choice, it's life and death. But still, bad choices can, but then there are social policies and systems and habits. And in Denver, you gotta work 110 hours, I was just out there, 110 hours a week at minimum wage to afford any kind of housing. And Denver isn't the worst housing market. 44 million Americans haven't got health insurance. Housing and healthcare are huge blocks of expense that cause poverty. So you've got to link personal and social responsibility. On Katrina, I would say what we need now is the poor are trapped in the debate about poverty. Not just stuck in poverty, they're trapped in the debate left and right. I want to see a new grand alliance where liberals would talk seriously about out-of-wedlock birth, family breakdown, personal ethics and responsibility, and conservatives would talk about strategic investments in affordable housing, health care, education, and child care. That would be a truly different political day when that might happen. It's going to happen least of all in Washington, D.C. It's got to start happening out in the community where we can get people from churches like yours and yours into relationship with people who are poor. When that happens, generally, what then happens between the people is a good thing, particularly if they're people of faith. I see it again and again, how people are transformed by human encounters with people who, what happened to me as a 14-year-old kid in the city of Detroit. I realized I was living in, me and the young black guys who are my age, when we met and worked side by side and began to talk, I realized we'd grown up in different countries, 2 miles apart. And it began to change me. So the real issue is how to get your folks into relationship somehow with people that they have been systematically, I would say deliberately, separated from. How do we reestablish that sense of relation? Then I think, you know, if a book study helps, that's good, but it won't finally be a book. It's finally going to be some kind of relationship that changes people. So that's what I struggle for.
Let's do one more question, and then Jim will be available for book signing afterwards, and you may have further comments you want to address to him. One more.
Who has the mic? There you are.
It's me. I'm just wondering if within your church you've seen any, or within the churches that you know about, whether you've seen any mechanisms that particularly help to create those relationships. Like, if we were at the point of wanting to take a practical step and start working on that, you know, what have you seen particularly successful?
I wrote a different book called Faith Works. The first chapter was, you got to get out of the house more often. And I think that's really, you know, you got to get out of the house more often. You got to go where there's these invisible signs that say no trespassing. You don't belong here. It's dangerous here. You're in trouble here. You just don't fit here. You got to break down those barriers. For college students, I recommend universally to every single college student, after you graduate, do not go to graduate school. Do not get a job. Do a year of voluntary service. Your Jesuits, join the Jesuit Voluntary Service Corps, JVC. The JVC has a wonderful slogan. It's called Ruined for Life, right? My brother ran JVC Midwest for 10 years. And I meet JVC Midwest people all over the country who knew my brother. And that 1 year in a shelter, in a clinic, on the street, doing something they wouldn't ever have otherwise done, changed all the rest of their decisions about what they did and how they did it. We have an internship program at Sojourners. We have 200 applications for 12 positions. Mennonites have them, and Lutherans have. There are non-religious ones. That's fine, but go overseas. Go to the city. Go to the border. Go to a reservation. Go someplace where you're going to get a whole different experience than you've had before. And like the JVC model, it'll ruin you for life, hopefully. You know. So I think that's the start, to put ourselves in places, in relationships that are not sort of where we are channeled by our society. Or in my Harvard class, I got students say, I'm in Harvard Law School. And the entire, it's not just pressure, it's the assumption. And Harvard Law School means corporate law. It's the only option we have available. Please help me resist corporate law. I want to be a lawyer, but I don't want to do corporate law. You know, I think this whole vocation gift thing is critical. What's your gift? Where does it meet the crushing needs of the world? You know, I really think we're at a time where things really could change. And there's a whole new generation now. Some are motivated by faith, some are spiritual but not religious. But whatever it is, whatever they call faith, it's wanting, a lot of young people just want some agenda worth the investment of their energy, time, gifts, their lives. They don't want to just fit into these structures and systems that just take you no place except to upper middle class existence that it's boring, And I meet a whole lot of young people who just want an agenda that's worthy of their commitment. And our staff is half under 30. We got senior staff 28, 29. And I'm very encouraged because something is happening now everywhere I go that makes me feel like we're on the cusp of something. And I'll finish just with a metaphor for you. People come to Washington to lobby, and I often get to speak to the groups before they go up to the Hill. And I sometimes say, okay, I want you to recognize, I remember at 2000, mostly moms coming off welfare, still on welfare, lobbying for a good welfare reform bill that would actually help them get off welfare and be self-sustaining. Things like childcare, that makes some sense, and they want to lobby. So I said, okay, these are like what I call Burger King moms, not soccer moms, not NASCAR dads, but the ones who work at the Burger King. And they, I've seen them, they go back and forth to drive a window to a table where there are 3 kids, helping the kids with their homework between orders at the drive-in window. She's on her own, deciding between winter boots, medicine, and rent for the kids. But when they're together in Washington, D.C., they feel like maybe they're stronger than they thought they were before. And so I said to them, here's how you recognize a member of Congress. You go to Capitol Hill and you look for the people who are walking around like this with their fingers up in the air. And they're often doing this, licking their fingers to see which way the wind is blowing. And we think that you change a nation by replacing one wet-fingered politician with another. It doesn't happen. We get discouraged, we withdraw, and get disillusioned. See, King and all the great practitioners of social movements understood. You change a nation not by replacing one wet-fingered politician with another. You change a nation only when you change the wind. Change the wind. It's amazing how quickly they change when you change the wind. I have known politicians who would do the right thing even if it cost them the next election. I have known politicians like that. But in 30 years, I can count them still on less than one hand. The others, middle group, wants to do the right thing. They really do. They really do. But you have to show them they won't lose an election for doing it. There's momentum. The wind is changing. The others, they don't care about anything but getting reelected. You change the wind, you get all 3 camps. All 3 groups will change. If you change the way people think, you change their moral sensibilities. King did that on the issue of race. And so how do we change the way people think and feel about their deepest values, even their faith, in relationship to public life? We can change that, and I see it all the time. I see tremendous change. We have this call to renewal. It's all these church groups. It's like a gang truce movement in the churches, because churches are like gangs. They got their grievances, their grudges, their paraphernalia. They all wear their paraphernalia. So call renewal is like a gang truce movement, and we got, the Catholics are there. They're a large gang, chapters every place they have. Then the Episcopalians, and we have the National Association of Evangelicals and the National Council of Churches. Those are like the Crips and the Bloods, I like to have a Mennonite on hand to sit between them to make sure nothing happens, and yet they're coming together in a way like I've never seen before, this broad cross-section. We had a convocation in June, Muslims and rabbis and imams and Sikhs and Buddhists and evangelicals and liberals and black, and it was just an amazing thing. And Bishop Ndagani, Desmond Tutu's successor, was the homilist. He pronounced this a kairos moment. Kairos time. Chronos time is when time is tick-tock, tick-tock. Kairos is when time opens up. It's like history opens up and new things are possible. I think this is a Kairos time. And the young people I meet around the country and the world convince me something is about to change. So I think our vocation, really, is not to be people who do ministry or who lobby or who are advocates. We're meant to be the wind changers. Our vocation is to change the wind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.